German prisoners of war arrived in America carrying not just the fatigue of battle, but also a heavy burden of belief. They had been told endlessly by Nazi propaganda that America was a land of weakness, soft, decadent, incapable of real endurance. Posters and radio broadcasts painted Americans as a nation of jazz-playing consumers, distracted by frivolous pleasures, unfit to face the discipline and determination of Germany's soldiers. Many of the captured officers and men believed these portrayals. It was easier to think that their enemies were weak rather than to face the reality of a long, grinding conflict. For months, they had heard from speeches that America was nothing more than a patchwork of immigrants, too divided and too lazy to fight. Their industrial might was dismissed as chaotic and undirected. Even their soldiers were said to be clumsy, spoiled, and unwilling to sacrifice. Around the campfires of North Africa and the bunkers of Europe, such ideas were repeated until they hardened into certainty. By the time capture came, German soldiers carried this worldview like armor. Some prisoners, still wearing the dust of Tunisian deserts or the mud of French fields, felt almost smug on the ships that carried them west. In their minds, America might hold them behind barbed wire, but it would never match the organization of the Wehrmacht or the spirit of Germany. The enemy's supposed wealth was dismissed as empty comfort, incapable of sustaining real war. What awaited them, however, would peel back those assumptions one layer at a time. The arrogance born of propaganda and early victories would soon clash with a reality that left them unsettled and silent. Their journey into captivity was not simply about losing freedom, it was about watching their entire image of America unravel. The certainty that America was weak did not form in a vacuum, it grew in the shadow of lightning victories that seemed to confirm every boast of German superiority. In France, armored columns had swept aside what was thought to be one of the strongest armies in the world. Entire divisions collapsed in weeks, and Paris itself fell like a prize plucked from a tree. Officers who later found themselves as prisoners recalled those days with swelling pride. To them, victory was proof that destiny favored Germany. The Balkans added another layer of confidence. Mountain strongholds and scattered defenses crumbled under coordinated German attacks. Villages and towns fell in rapid sequence, and soldiers believed they were witnessing the unstoppable momentum of history itself. Tales of American softness sounded all the more convincing when compared to the ease with which supposedly tough enemies were brushed aside. Even in North Africa, where the desert pushed men to their limits, the German Afrika Korps carved out a reputation that bordered on legend. Their armored thrusts and tactical skill made headlines, and the name of their commander was spoken with reverence. For the soldiers, these victories seemed like living proof that German willpower and discipline were unmatched. Every triumph reinforced the idea that Germany's future was secure, that their enemies could not match their resolve. This confidence, however, carried within it the seed of blindness. The very arrogance that made them proud also made them unprepared for the scale of what they would later witness across the Atlantic. The journey into captivity began not with chains or hunger, but with a surprise that unsettled the German prisoners more than they cared to admit. Expecting rough treatment and hardship, many braced themselves for cattle cars, bare wooden benches, or worse. Instead, when the trains pulled up to carry them deeper into the heart of America, they found padded seats, wide windows, and dining cars where meals were served. The atmosphere felt more like travel for businessmen or tourists than transport for captured enemy soldiers. Men who had marched for days on empty stomachs in North Africa now sat in upholstered comfort, the vibration of the train oddly soothing compared to the jolts of military trucks. Some stared in disbelief at the dining cars where food was laid out neatly, with white tablecloths, metal cutlery, and steaming plates. They whispered among themselves, unsure whether this was a trick or a temporary gesture before harsher treatment began. Yet as the miles rolled by, it became clear this was normal. For many, the confusion cut deeper than the comfort itself. Nazi propaganda had spoken endlessly of America's supposed barbarism, painting a picture of cruelty and chaos. But here, prisoners were treated with civility, given accommodations far above what they had imagined. It was not kindness alone that shocked them. It was the casual, unforced way it was offered, as though America had so much to spare that even its prisoners could ride in comfort. In those first hours of captivity, the German worldview began to fracture. It was not yet respect, nor admiration, but a creeping realization that their assumptions about America might not survive this journey. As the train carried them deeper across the American landscape, another shock awaited the German prisoners. Night fell, and instead of darkness, the world outside their windows seemed to blaze with light. Town after town appeared on the horizon, glowing like constellations scattered across the earth. Street lamps lined the roads, neon signs flickered above shops, and houses gleamed with windows lit warmly from within. For men who had grown used to blackouts, rationed electricity and streets cloaked in shadow, the sight was almost unbelievable. In Germany, darkness had become a constant companion. Entire neighborhoods were ordered to extinguish their lights to avoid drawing enemy bombers. Families huddled by candles or faint lamps hidden behind thick curtains. Children grew up thinking of night as a time of silence and fear. But in America, the prisoners saw a country that seemed untouched by war. Lights burned freely, unafraid of attack, and the air itself carried a sense of normal life continuing without interruption. Some pressed their faces against the glass, murmuring disbelief to one another. How could a nation at war shine so brightly while Germany's cities lay in rubble? How could these ordinary towns waste electricity on glowing advertisements, when back home, hospitals struggled to power their equipment? The glow of America's abundance was more than physical, it was psychological. It told the prisoners that they had entered a country whose resources were not strained, whose confidence allowed it to shine when others hid. That quiet but radiant truth struck harder than any speech. In the lights of those small towns, many Germans glimpsed the first undeniable sign that their own nation might not prevail. The first whispers about American shipyards reached the German prisoners almost as rumors too exaggerated to be believed. They had been told of massive vessels called Liberty ships, cargo carriers essential to Allied logistics. But when camp guards or newspapers spoke of these ships being built in mere days, many POWs laughed, dismissing it as another attempt at propaganda. In Germany, even with round-the-clock labor, the construction of a single vessel was measured in months, sometimes longer. The idea that the Americans could launch one after another in less than a week seemed absurd. That disbelief did not last long. Some prisoners were assigned to labor near ports and factories where they witnessed the truth with their own eyes. Towering cranes lifted steel plates into place. Welders worked in synchronized lines, and assembly resembled the speed of an automobile factory rather than a naval yard. Workers moved with practiced precision, men and women side by side, driving rivets and welding seams. The skeleton of a ship would appear in days, its hull completed before the Germans could process what they were watching. Even officers who prided themselves on discipline and logic were silent. The sheer organization, the scale of manpower and the availability of endless steel challenged everything they thought they knew about industrial war. They counted the ships lined along the docks, stretching farther than the eye could follow, and realized that each one represented supplies, tanks, fuel, and men ferried across oceans. It was a moment of stunned recognition. If America could replace losses faster than Germany could even record them, then the war was not just a clash of armies, it was a race of production. And in that race, the Germans saw themselves hopelessly outmatched. If the speed of Liberty ship construction left the German prisoners stunned, the scale of the ports themselves nearly defied imagination. As transport trains pulled into coastal hubs, they saw forests of cranes stretching into the sky, their long arms dipping and rising with mechanical rhythm. Entire convoys of trucks rumbled in lines, unloading mountains of steel, food and machinery that disappeared into cavernous warehouses before reappearing on waiting ships. For men accustomed to the smaller, strained harbors of Europe, this choreography of industry seemed almost otherworldly. A single American port could move more cargo in a day than entire German cities managed in a week. Barges glided across wide rivers stacked with containers, while railroad tracks branched like veins, delivering resources from the heart of the continent to the edge of the sea. The prisoners compared it to their own wartime experience: bombed-out docks in Hamburg, shortages of coal, workers scraping by with broken equipment. Here, however, everything moved with a confidence born of abundance. Trains arrived by the hour, ships departed by the dozen, and nothing seemed in short supply. Many POWs stood silent, watching the endless stream of goods flowing outward. If America could send this much material across oceans without pause, what hope did Germany's dwindling factories have? The realization gnawed at them: this was not just wealth, It was organization on a scale their own nation could never match. The sight of cranes lifting crates into the bellies of ships was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The first time a bottle of Coca-Cola was handed to a German prisoner, the moment felt almost unreal. In their minds, such things were reserved for generals, politicians, or wealthy elites, never for ordinary men, and certainly not for enemies held behind barbed wire. Yet here it was, a glass bottle cold to the touch, fizzing softly when opened. The amber liquid sparkled under the camp lights, its sweetness promising a taste they had only heard about in rumors. Some prisoners hesitated, thinking it must be a trick. In Germany, Coca-Cola had been scarce for years, rationed to the point of near disappearance. For soldiers who had lived on black bread, watery soup, and ersatz coffee, the idea that their captors would hand them a drink viewed as a global symbol of luxury was almost insulting in its absurdity. And yet when the first sip touched their tongues, disbelief gave way to shock. The sweetness exploded against taste buds, dulled by years of scarcity, and the crisp fizz was unlike anything they had known. Around them other prisoners murmured in amazement, clutching their bottles as though they were treasures. Some laughed at the absurdity, others shook their heads in silence. To many it was not just a drink, it was proof that America had such abundance, it could afford to give luxuries to those who had tried to kill its sons. The realization hit harder than any speech or lecture. In that simple act of being served Coca-Cola, the German POWs glimpsed a different kind of power. This was not propaganda, this was lived experience, a luxury freely given, and a signal that their world had shifted in ways they could barely comprehend. For the German prisoners, the true weight of that Coca-Cola bottle became clear only when they remembered how different things had been back home. In Germany, Coca-Cola had almost vanished by the middle of the war. Factories could no longer import the syrup, sugar was rationed to the last grain, and bottles that once sold in cafes became tokens of prestige for party officials or wealthy families. Ordinary soldiers, even those who had fought bravely, rarely saw such luxury. For most, the taste of Coca-Cola was little more than a rumor, something whispered about in barracks but never held in hand. And yet here in the middle of captivity, the drink was handed out casually, sometimes with meals, sometimes at special occasions, as if it were nothing more than water. That contrast burned deep. Men who had gone hungry in bombed-out German cities now sat sipping a drink that had symbolized unattainable luxury just months before. The message was not lost on them. America had so much that it could give away what Germany could no longer even dream of supplying to its own citizens. Some POWs envied the ease with which Americans lived, their casual access to things Germans associated with privilege. Others simply marveled at the contrast, shaking their heads in disbelief. In the fizz of Coca-Cola, they tasted more than sugar and carbonation. They tasted abundance, a casual wealth that revealed the true scale of America's resources. The drink, once dismissed as frivolous, became to them a symbol of overwhelming strength. Not military strength, but the kind that came from a society so confident in its prosperity that even prisoners of war were treated to luxuries. Germany could no longer provide. If Coca-Cola had been a shock, ice cream was nothing short of bewildering. For German prisoners of war, the idea that frozen cream and sugar could appear in their mess halls seemed closer to fantasy than reality. In wartime Europe, ice cream had vanished long before the prisoners were captured. Milk was scarce, sugar scarcer still, and refrigeration was often a luxury reserved only for hospitals or government facilities. Many of the younger soldiers had not tasted it since childhood, and some of the older men had nearly forgotten the sensation altogether. So when bowls of ice cream were set before them in American camps, laughter and disbelief filled the room. The creamy texture, cold and rich, seemed almost unreal against palates accustomed to watered soup and stale bread. Some men ate cautiously at first, half expecting a trick, but soon they scooped eagerly, savoring every bite. Prisoners nudged each other, shaking their heads, muttering that this could not possibly be happening. What startled them most was not just the taste, but the casualness with which it was offered. For Americans it was just dessert, an ordinary treat served to children, soldiers, and now even to enemy. For the Germans it carried the weight of a luxury item, the kind of indulgence that symbolized everything their own nation could no longer provide. To sit in captivity, eating ice cream while their homeland suffered under rationing and bombing, struck many as surreal. In that moment disbelief melted into something more profound, a dawning realization that America's power was not only measured in ships and tanks, but in its ability to make luxury feel ordinary. Ice cream, a small thing in peacetime, became to them a quiet revelation of abundance. For the German prisoners, the presence of ice cream in their daily lives quickly grew into more than a novelty. It became a symbol. They had grown up in a Europe where luxuries vanished the moment war tightened its grip. Milk was diverted to hospitals and infants, sugar was carefully measured in ration books, and even basic refrigeration was often reserved for the wealthy or powerful. In Germany, ice cream during wartime was unthinkable. Yet in America, even with millions of soldiers deployed overseas, there was still enough surplus to serve frozen desserts to prisoners of war. That contrast struck deep. Each spoonful reminded them of a society so abundant that what Germans considered a luxury was, in America, nothing more than an afterthought. Some POWs whispered to each other that this was the true power of the Allies, not only the tanks and bombers, but the ability to make extravagance routine. The very casualness of it, the fact that guards and civilians thought little of sharing such treats, carried a message more powerful than any propaganda leaflet. Over time, ice cream became a quiet marker of America's strength in their minds. It was not arrogance that impressed them, but confidence, the ability to treat enemies with indulgence because resources were so plentiful. What Germany could not provide even to its own children, America could hand out to prisoners without hesitation. In this way, a bowl of ice cream spoke louder than speeches. It told them that abundance was not just possible but normal, and that realization filled them with a stunned, reluctant respect. As the German prisoners were sent to work details across the American heartland, they began to notice something even more unsettling than liberty ships or factory cranes: the everyday wealth of ordinary workers. It was not the generals or politicians who amazed them, but the farmers, machinists, and dockhands they encountered each day. Men who would have been near the bottom of society back home arrived at their jobs in cars, sometimes second-hand, sometimes brand new, while their wives drove into town with groceries or children in tow. In Germany, even many officers could not dream of such ownership during the war. The POWs looked down at their own worn boots and then noticed the sturdy, well-made leather boots on the feet of American laborers. These were not luxuries reserved for officers or party elites, but the footwear of ordinary men. At lunchtime, they watched workers open tin lunch boxes filled with sandwiches thick with meat, fruit polished and fresh, and sometimes even slices of cake. The prisoners whispered among themselves, astonished that this was not a feast but a simple midday meal. What shook them most was the casual way Americans treated these comforts. Cars, boots, and full lunches were not displayed with pride. They were simply normal, expected parts of life. That normalcy made the gap between the two worlds painfully clear. For Germans accustomed to scarcity, ration cards, and patched clothing, the sight of such abundance in the hands of ordinary laborers was almost too much to process. In these simple, relatable details, the POWs encountered a truth more striking than any statistic. America's strength was not hidden in weapons alone, but in the prosperity of its common people. The more time the German prisoners spent in America, the more disturbing their observations became. It was not only that ordinary workers owned cars, boots, and houses. It was that they lived in a way that rivaled and in many cases surpassed the lifestyles of German elite. For officers who had once dined at fine tables in Berlin or attended parties thrown by party officials, this realization was deeply unsettling. In America, a factory foreman or farmer seemed to live with more security, comfort, and freedom than the privileged classes of Germany. They saw it in the spacious homes dotting the countryside, each with electricity, running water, and even central heating. These were not mansions for aristocrats, but family houses for workers. They noticed radios in nearly every home, sometimes even two. They heard of families taking weekend trips, eating ice cream on Sundays, and buying new clothes without ration coupons or special privilege. The contrast could not have been sharper. In Germany, even high-ranking officers scrambled to secure luxuries for their family. Here in America, luxuries had become everyday life for the common man. At first, some POWs dismissed it as temporary, a show of strength meant to demoralize them, but the longer they stayed, the more undeniable it became. Democracy had created a society where prosperity was broadly shared. For many, this realization was more shocking than any battlefield defeat. In quiet conversations at night, prisoners admitted a grudging respect. America's hidden strength was not only in its factories and armies, but in its ability to give ordinary citizens lives that felt extraordinary compared to Europe. It was here that admiration began to take root, planted by the simple, undeniable evidence of ordinary abundance. If the prisoners had already been shaken by America's material abundance, what they saw inside the factories struck at the very core of their beliefs. German propaganda had hammered endlessly that democracies were weak because they allowed women too much freedom and treated minorities as equal. In Nazi teaching, such a society could never fight a serious war, yet in the roaring workshops of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and New Orleans, the POWs witnessed a reality that shattered those certainties. Women in coveralls climbed ladders to weld steel beams. Young women with scarves tied over their hair operated cranes that swung tons of material across the floor with steady precision. Lines of women riveted aircraft panels, their movements synchronized, their pace relentless. To German eyes raised on the idea that women belonged only in the home, the sight was astonishing. Equally jarring were the men of every background working side by side. African American workers handled complex machinery, pouring molten steel, driving forklifts, and supervising assembly lines. Hispanic and Asian laborers moved in and out of shifts, their uniforms smeared with the same grease and sweat as everyone else. Teenagers, barely older than recruits sent to die in North Africa, managed drill presses and measured tolerances on precision parts. The factories never slept. 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The work continued without pause. The prisoners had been told such diversity would breed chaos, inefficiency, and weakness. Instead, they saw output on a scale that dwarfed Germany's best effort. Confronted with this living contradiction, many POWs fell silent. Their ideology told them such a system was doomed. Their eyes told them it was unstoppable. In that clash between belief and reality, the cracks in their worldview widened into deep fractures. If the diversity of America's workforce challenged the German prisoners' beliefs, the scale of production finished the job. They had walked through gates into factories so large they felt like cities under a roof. Conveyor belts stretched longer than village streets. The constant rumble of machines shook the floor, and everywhere they looked, parts flowed in endless streams. Steel plates, engines, bolts, rivets, and weapons moving forward toward completion. One POW once employed in the Ruhr steel industry confessed to his comrades that a single American plant produced more in a week than his region could in a month. Blast furnaces poured rivers of molten metal, supplied by endless trains carrying ore from the Midwest. The thought of trying to match this output with Germany's bombed and rationed industries seemed laughable. They counted Liberty ships sliding off the docks at a pace that stunned them. In Germany, the launch of one vessel was a celebrated event. Here, ships were born daily, as casually as bread leaving an oven. At Republic Steel, daily production exceeded 10,000 tons, numbers that felt almost unreal when compared to the factories back home. The prisoners whispered to each other that even if Germany fought on with courage and skill, it could never overcome this tide. For every rifle or tank they produced, America could build 5, 10, or 20 more. What they saw before their eyes was not just industry, it was inevitability. The realization left them awestruck, their pride hollowing into disbelief. The war, they began to understand, was already lost inside these walls of steel and fire. For the German prisoners, the greatest humiliation did not come from guns, factories, or even defeat in battle. It came from something as ordinary as a garbage bin. In the camps, they watched in disbelief as American soldiers and even fellow prisoners tossed half-eaten bread, unfinished meat and fruit with blemishes into piles of waste. To men who had lived through rationing where every crumb was saved and scraps were boiled into weak soup, this casual disposal of food felt like a personal insult. At first they whispered angrily among themselves, surely this was done on purpose. A cruel trick to break their spirit. But it was not a performance. For Americans, wasting food was simply a byproduct of having too much. Dinner tables were piled high, plates were refilled without question, and if something wasn't finished, it went straight into the trash. What Germany had rationed for families of 4 was discarded here without a second thought. Some prisoners could not bear the sight. One officer admitted that he wept quietly when he saw mountains of fruit being plowed under to stabilize prices. To him, it was proof that Germany's sacrifices had been for nothing, that their supposed enemies lived with such abundance they could destroy what his people had been dying without. Others felt a deep sense of shame. How could they tell their families back home, starving under the bombs, that they had thrown away food simply because there was too much? In those moments the propaganda of sacrifice and superiority collapsed. Against overflowing tables and wasted bread, Germany's claims of resilience shrank into silence. Abundance, they realized, was its own kind of weapon, one their nation could never match. As winter settled over the camps, the bitterness of defeat weighed heavily on the German prisoners. Yet Christmas brought with it an experience they could hardly believe. Instead of scorn or indifference, they were met with warmth. Local communities, many of whom had lost sons and brothers to the very army these men had fought for, organized gestures of kindness that cut through the bitterness of captivity. On Christmas Eve, church choirs gathered outside the camp fences to sing carols. The melodies drifted through the cold night air, familiar hymns shared across nations, filling the prisoners with a sense of unexpected peace. For a moment the barbed wire seemed to fade, replaced by the simple humanity of shared tradition. Inside the mess halls the POWs were served meals unlike anything they had seen since before the war: turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, pies, even cookies wrapped in paper from local families. Some men stared at their plates in silence before eating, overcome by the thought that their enemies were giving them more than their own government had ever provided. Others whispered prayers, their voices trembling with gratitude. For those who had spent months convinced they were hated beyond redemption, the gestures carried immense weight. They realized that America did not just want to defeat them, it wanted to prove that strength could come with mercy. In those quiet hours around tables laden with food and surrounded by carols from beyond the wire, many prisoners felt something stir inside them. It was not loyalty to America, but a spark of redemption, a reminder that humanity could survive even in war. It was the first glimpse of hope for a life beyond ideology. The breaking point for many German prisoners came not in the fields or factories, but in the flickering light of a projector. Gathered in camp halls, they watched newsreels of the Normandy invasion. At first there was disbelief. Surely the Allies could not have assembled such a force. But as the film rolled on, silence spread. The screen showed endless convoys of ships stretching across the horizon, a steel armada greater than anything Germany had ever imagined. Landing craft surged toward the beaches in waves, while overhead the sky darkened with the shadows of thousands of aircraft. For soldiers who had once prided themselves on discipline and efficiency, the sheer scale of logistics on display was crushing. Trains unloaded mountains of supplies onto artificial harbors. Trucks streamed across open beaches carrying food, fuel, and ammunition. The camera lingered on rows of tanks waiting to roll inland, more machines in a single shot than some German divisions had left in the field. The POWs exchanged glances, their faces pale. They knew what such images meant. The war was no longer a contest of courage or tactics, but of resources, and America's resources seemed endless. What Germany called its miracle weapons looked pitiful beside the overwhelming tide of Allied production. One prisoner later recalled that in that moment he felt his pride hollow out. "We had been told that destiny was on our side," he admitted. But destiny was there on that screen, in every ship, every plane, every truck. Against that, what were we? As the projector clicked to a stop, the room remained quiet. The myth of Nazi superiority had collapsed, drowned in the roar of engines and waves at Normandy. If the newsreels of Normandy had destroyed the illusion of military victory, what came next shattered something deeper. In the spring of 1945, American guards gathered the prisoners once more to show them newly released footage from liberated concentration camps. At first many scoffed, assuming it was propaganda meant to humiliate, but as the images unspooled, emaciated survivors, mass graves, and piles of shoes and clothing, their protests died in their throats. Some prisoners buried their faces in their hands, unable to watch. Others sat rigid, their jaws clenched, whispering that it could not be true. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. American soldiers stood in the films speaking plainly of what they had witnessed. Letters arriving from home confirmed the horror. Friends and relatives, writing from Germany, described hearing the same accounts, impossible to deny. For men who had once believed they were fighting for honor and civilization, the revelation was devastating. One officer later admitted that it was in that moment he stopped thinking of himself as a soldier and began to see himself as a tool of criminals. "We thought we carried culture," he confessed, "but we carried death." The silence in the barracks that night was heavier than any defeat. The enemy they had once called weak had shown them mercy and abundance. Their own leaders, in contrast, had led them into shame. The realization marked the final collapse, not only of Germany's military cause, but of the moral foundation on which it had been built. When the war finally ended, and the prisoners were repatriated, many carried home memories far stranger than battlefield stories. They had expected to recount hardship and humiliation, but instead, they returned with tales of Coca-Cola bottles handed out freely, of bowls of ice cream served in mess halls, of chocolate bars given without hesitation. To families still enduring hunger and shortages in ruined Germany, such accounts sounded like fantasy. For years these men had been fed slogans about America's weakness and decadence, yet what they described was abundance so casual it bordered on shock. Children listened wide-eyed as fathers explained how guards had poured fizzy drinks into their cups at Christmas, or how cartons of milk were available every morning. Wives struggling to stretch meager rations could scarcely imagine tables where prisoners had been offered second helping. These stories spread quickly, passing from returning soldiers to neighbors and then across entire towns. They were not about tanks, planes, or military victories, but about small luxuries that symbolized something larger. Taste of ice cream, a sip of Coca-Cola. These were not just novelties but signs of a society so confident in its strength that it could share its comforts even with enemies. For many Germans the contrast was painful but also illuminating. They began to see that America's power was not only military or industrial but cultural, rooted in a way of life that valued prosperity, variety, and even pleasure. The tales of those treats planted quiet seeds of hope, whispers that perhaps Germany too could one day move beyond scarcity and fear into a future of abundance. In the years that followed, those simple luxuries lingered in memory far more vividly than the sound of guns. For many former prisoners, Coca-Cola and ice cream became shorthand for something larger, the quiet power of democracy. They had expected victory to be measured in weapons and conquest, but what stayed with them was the taste of a drink once reserved for elites, freely shared even with captives. When West Germany began its reconstruction, these memories carried weight. Politicians, teachers, and ordinary workers who had once sat behind barbed wire now told stories of American abundance. They spoke of factories that never stopped, but also of kindness in the smallest gestures, of a camp cook slipping an extra cookie, of locals singing carols outside the wire, of a bottle of soda placed in their hands without hesitation. Such stories reminded Germans that prosperity and humanity were not opposites, but partners. These experiences reshaped their idea of strength. They had seen a nation that built not through fear but through inclusion, that wielded industry not only for war but for comfort. It was a lesson that echoed as West Germany embraced democracy, prosperity, and alliance with its former enemy. By the 1950s, when Germany rose from ruins into an economic miracle, veterans often credited those unexpected symbols: Coca-Cola fizzing in a glass, a scoop of melting ice cream, as proof that another way of life was possible. They were reminders that real power lay not in domination, but in the confidence to share. In that sense, the legacy of those treats endured, not as trivial luxuries but as emblems of redemption, evidence that mercy, abundance, and freedom could transform even enemies into partners in building a better world.